This is what they wanted to talk about. The Home Secretary on the ground in Iraq, where many smuggling gangs are based, signing a new deal to ensure failed Iraqi asylum seekers are returned home more swiftly and more intelligence sharing. But it's not illegal migration causing the new government problems today. It's the legal kind the old government allowed to reach record levels. New, revised numbers so high they prompted scrambling a last-minute prime ministerial press conference.
Good afternoon. The Independent Office of National Statistics has conducted vital work on the state of immigration and found the previous government were running an open borders experiment.
The headline is that net migration, that's the number of people entering the country minus those leaving, has come down by a fifth since last year, falling to around 730,000. But we also learned today that the level of net migration last year was actually much higher than we first thought. The revised figures showing it was actually more than 900,000, nearly 250,000 more than their initial estimate. And they've done the same for 2022, 100,000 more than their first estimate. So that means across the two previous years combined, the Office for National Statistics was underestimating net migration by 360,000.
We will reform the points-based system and make sure that applications for the relevant visa routes, whether it's the skilled worker route or the shortage occupation list, will now come with new expectations on training people here in our country. Because clearly the vast majority of people who entered this country did so to plug gaps in our workforce.
Plenty of those plugs have been applied across the care sector. 7 years post-Brexit, and the number of non-EU nationals coming to the UK for work last year reached 417,000. Numbers which the Prime Minister says the Conservatives foisted on the nation, allowing low-skilled workers to enter the country. And the Conservatives say, well, they agree.
You had 14 years to do that. Why did you get it so wrong?
Well, Kemi and I acknowledged yesterday that successive governments over 20 or 30 years have made mistakes on migration. Of course, for some of those years, we had free movement, so the government couldn't actually cap the numbers. But we do now need a different approach with a hard cap and a pivot away from mass low-skill migration.
The problem with tacking to the right, someone else is already occupying that space.
Immigration figures, which are horrendous. Horrendous if you want to get a GP appointment.
The Reform Party today announcing 100,000 fully paid up members, numbers to rival the Conservatives, and one of them a former Tory minister, Dame Andrea Jenkins. But this speech about membership centred mainly on migration. And the problem for both the Tories and Labour, this thorn in both their sides doesn't have to take responsibility for either causing their political problem or fixing it.
Those migration figures weren't the only numbers causing the Prime Minister problems today. We also learned that the bill for accommodation and support for asylum seekers rose by 36% last year to £5.4 billion. Now look, for all of those issues, the government, the Prime Minister, can point to the Conservatives and say, look what we inherited. They did it with the state of prisons, they did it with a £22 billion black hole they say they inherited in the economy. Quite a few people have made a point though today, well, we didn't actually hear any solutions from the Prime Minister. All we heard was about a possible white paper to look into finding solutions. And at some point, the electorate is going to turn around. They have a nasty habit of doing this at elections and saying, well, we don't care what you inherited, we care with what you've done about it. And talk to ministers off the record, quite a few of them make the point, they're not entirely convinced that any easy solutions actually exist especially when you're trying to grow the economy.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now is the former head of UK Border Control, Tony Smith. Tony Smith, it's good to have you back on the programme. So when Keir Starmer said that the Tories' policy on migration was an experiment in open borders by design, do you think he was right?
I think there's a bit of political rhetoric creeping into some of these discussions, but I think it is fair to say that the last government did preside over record numbers of immigration, much of which was within their control. Small boat irregular arrivals only account for about 10% of this number. A lot of the intake over the last couple of years have been visas issued to workers, workers' dependents, students, student dependents. I think the Conservatives realised this was creeping up too high towards the end of their tenure. They did make some changes, which is why we've seen a small drop in the numbers this year over last year. But it's going to take some time, I think, for those changes to take real effect.
Now, the Prime Minister talked quite tough, didn't he, today? I mean, the language at times sounded almost like Nigel Farage. But does he have a plan to match the tough rhetoric?
Well, if he has, I haven't seen it yet. Not on legal migration. We've heard a lot from the government about what they're going to do about illegal migration and smashing the gangs, but we haven't had any clear policy statements about what they're going to do about visas. I think some of the measures that were introduced by the Conservative government have been placed on pause while they have a look at this. I think they're fortunate. They will see a gradual reduction anyway as a result of the changes, provided they don't overturn them, of the changes that were made under the last administration. But this is still very, very high numbers. And I think most people, whether they're on the right or the left, would agree that these figures, these latest net migration figures, are too high. And also, you know, we're not very good at counting, are we? Because we've just revised the 23 and the 22 figures upwards. And it's very possible that the figures that have been announced today will also be revised upwards when we get to this time next year.
And upwards by a considerable margin, so pretty lousy at counting. I just wonder if I know you don't like to talk politics, but is there a political risk for Sir Keir Starmer to use the tough language of the right on migration, but not actually able to do anything about it?
Well, I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I spent 40 years working in the Home Office, working for lots of different governments who made lots of different promises, but ultimately the electorate will tell you if you've delivered on your promises or if you haven't. I can remember the Blair government saying they made mistakes actually when they were in office on this. We've just had an acknowledgement from the Conservatives yesterday that they also made mistakes, but this is within government control. They can control how many visas get issued. They simply need to make that clear to Whitehall departments about what their policy is. Some will argue that we need more migrants for economic reasons. Others will say that we've got far too many because we can't afford the service provision. That's what the arguments are all about.
But isn't that also the problem? We saw that in Paul's piece about the care sector. The care sector needs people yesterday. It needs an awful lot of people all the time. And they simply can't wait for the right numbers of people in this country who are already here to get trained up for those jobs. How do you persuade them not to bring in people from outside?
Well, I think you have to make employment such as those more attractive, don't you? I think that is really the crux of this, is that employers are turning to overseas migrants because they know overseas migrants, some of them will work for considerably less money than the indigenous population. So we need to look at those industries and make them more attractive for people so that they are prepared to work in those industries. And I think, you know, we've seen recent reports about the number of people already in this country who are economically inactive for one reason or another. And I think that's where the focus needs to go. I've heard slogans before from politicians about British jobs for British people and all that, but I do think it's more fundamental than that. We've got a very significant population increase now as a result of immigration. We need to make sure that as much of that population as possible is economically active and providing for GDP per capita. Not just GDP, but GDP per capita. So they are net actually contributors to society. That's what we really need.
OK. Got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Tony Smith, thank you very much indeed. Kieran.
Thanks, Matt. Well, let's talk now to Sundar Katwala, Director of British Future, a non-partisan think tank that works on immigration and integration issues. And just picking up on Keir Starmer's language there, accusing the Conservatives of being the party of open borders. I mean, given that language, what level of migration, net migration, do you think the public will be willing to accept?
Well, he's got a reasonable point that this is the immigration numbers for the week before the general election. So this is the final score of the old government. He's got a reasonable point that the last government made promises that were the opposite of what happened. But I think he should be careful with his language about open borders. We didn't have open borders. We had tighter EU migration, very open non-EU migration by design, quite a draconian asylum system, a very welcoming policy to Ukrainians and refugees. In terms of the overall number, The adjustments today show you why setting a net migration target doesn't work. You know the number of visas, you don't know the level of emigration, so your net migration target doesn't work. You can look at each of the flows that you have. The public feel the same dilemmas as the politicians. The public think the numbers are high and put pressures on housing. The public don't want to cut immigration for the NHS, for social care, for university students. So there is a balance to be struck there, and you should take the public more seriously by actually engaging them in the debate about the pressures and gains and the choices that we make.
You raise housing, though, and you also think Keir Starmer shouldn't set a target. If you don't set a target for net migration, how do you know how many houses you need to build?
Well, there's a lesson here, which is if you want to keep your promises, don't make promises you can't keep. Keir Starmer has said he's going to have immigration lower than he's inherited. Well, he's been given a very high ceiling by the Conservatives, net 700,000. What I would do is have an immigration plan in Parliament for 3 years, have an annual day that looks like the budget, and be held to account. Because for the last 14 years, there was a slogan and a policy. There was no accountability about how the numbers were going. If it's higher than you were expecting, tell us what you were doing with the tax receipts. If you're trying to reduce it by increasing skills, tell us how it's going. If you've decided to have a policy, and Keir Starmer's opposition Labour Party supported the Ukraine policy and the Hong Kong policy for very good reasons. If you're going to have a policy that implements it, then tell us about how we're managing it.
I'm sorry to cut in there, though, but we haven't got much time left. I suppose the question is, every time you pull one of those big levers, there's a risk, you know, that for universities, for instance, you know, how do you go back to 29 levels for universities? That would be financially ruinous.
So everyone supported the graduate visa and high student migration. We should make sure we're handling it well. So the public are sceptical about reducing specific visas while they worry about the numbers. So let's have a serious debate about the choices we make and how we manage it well. On the whole, the public concern is highest about the visible lack of control of asylum, even though people were very welcoming of the Ukraine scheme, the Hong Kong scheme, and the managed system. So managing asylum better is really important. But let's take the dilemmas of control seriously instead of having slogans and policies that aren't met. Keir Starmer, I think, is going to see net migration fall to levels more like the historic levels, net 400,000. And so he should be careful that he's not perceived to be held up to Nigel Farage's policy by telling us what his own policy is.
Okay, Sundar Katwala, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you ever so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.